Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Philip Currian. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at the Family Room. And today we are doing the webinar that's entitled, What is Here to Stay? Just to give you a little synopsis of what the topic is today, we have, as a part of our work, we track these emotional priorities of different target groups across a number of cohort groups and waved through the years. And at a moment of such unprecedented change, many of us are really trying to figure out what this new normal, because we've seen a lot of shifts in these emotional drivers, will look like, and what are the changes in people's emotional priorities will really stick around. And I think that's the question that everybody's really asking as we go into month 7 of what's happened with the COVID. In short, we're all trying to understand what will be the new drivers of emotional relevance for brands and media properties, whatever it is that you're particularly focused on. While there is no crystal ball, our passion point construct was really designed to answer these types of questions. And George Carey, our founder and CEO, has spent the past decade using these learnings to help clients really anticipate the future and try to begin to decipher what some of these changes mean. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to George. And as always, if you have questions about what he's presenting and want to know a little bit more, there is a question a box that you have. Please send questions, and at the end of the webinar, we'll try to address as many of them as time permits. Thank you. And George?
Yeah, thank you, Philip, and thank you all for joining. It's nice to have you here. I think Philip mentioned like the operative word in this presentation and the work we're going to share today, which is relevance. In addition to this idea of what is here to stay, I think the idea of what does that have to do with and how can that inform my strategies for maintaining relevance for my brand. As we have said, the world is changing very rapidly between COVID and racial unrest and the pandemic, and certainly the political campaign from last night, I think gave us a pretty good idea that there's not going to be what you would call a quiet and calm fall. It's really been very difficult to understand exactly what is going to be the final emotional outcome on consumers. And importantly, what's going to be the long-term imprint. And I think that really lives on 3 different levels. Of course, at a human level, I think we're all very curious to know exactly which of these imprints will sort of stick with us at a consumer level. But we're also hearing many of our clients ask the same question in a much more pressing manner at a category level. How are these shifts in the emotional DNA of my consumers kind of flowing into the world of my category and ultimately impacting the drivers of choice very near and dear to my heart, whatever category that might be. And we'll talk about a number of them in the course of the next 25 minutes or so. And then, of course, at the very top of the pyramid for most of this is our brand. What are these implications going to have for how I make sure that my service, my brand, my company stays relevant and sort of stays attuned to these new shifted passion points and priorities in a post-pandemic world. So, I think that one of the things that we've also heard a lot about is the whole notion that behaviors can be temporal. The people will do certain things during a pandemic or during other times of crisis, which when the crisis ends, those behaviors go away. I'd love to see our friends at Lysol or Procter & Gamble continue to sell lots of more toilet paper and household disinfectant. But my guess is that once the pandemic passes, the shelves will be pretty well stocked with toilet paper. That was kind of a temporary aberration, which I think had a lot to do with the circumstances of the time. Emotion is different. Emotions, you'll see in a second, does not go away the minute these kinds of periods of cultural upheaval disappear. And as you heard from Philip, we have a very powerful tool for measuring those emotional shifts from period to period, quarter to quarter, year to year, in the form of our passion point study. To the best of our knowledge, this is the only study that tracks the shifting emotional priorities of consumers and the drivers of relevance in a rapidly changing world with data. This is not qualitative or kind of social listening. This is a very robust study which measures 150 passion points that drive emotional relevance. It looks across 4 different generational models, including kids, Gen Z, young adults, and Gen X. And we've talked to a whole lot of different consumers over the course of this study and have a very good sort of foundational level of insight off of which to measure these things. In addition to measuring, again, because it's a longitudinal study, we can track changes in these emotional priorities. We have 10 years of longitudinal tracking, which we now update quarterly. We also look very closely at 12 individual product categories. So we can see exactly which of these human truths that are becoming reshaped and reformed are manifesting in the world of breakfast, or the world of media, or the world of gaming, or whatever other category that we track, and others can be added. For those brands that are a part of this study, we also can help you understand exactly which of those new emotional imperatives live or don't live in the emotional DNA of your brand, which is a very good measurement of its relevance and its future relevance in the world that we are about to inhabit. And from that, we can help you understand your most emotional valuable assets for relevance, and which to deploy in your messaging, your product, or your innovation strategy, and certainly the most relevant new products and content or campaigns going forward. We're a very small company, but we have very big clients. We're very, very proud of our client list, and I think they come to us because this is a very unique resource, which has become particularly germane in a time when relevance is so important. So I think that one of the points that I made earlier is that behaviors can be temporal and emotions tend to be here to stay. And let me just give you a quick example of some data before we get into 2020. This is historical data from which we kind of draw this conclusion. We have been tracking these passion points, as I mentioned earlier, for some little while. And this will give you an idea of the last episode of cultural disruption. We've been through about 4 different episodes of massive global cultural disruption, which have fundamentally altered the emotional priorities of consumers across the world. The last one was in 2016, but we sort of go all the way back to 9/11 and work forward from there. But the last one was one which has been very underreported, which is what happened in 2016, a year in which we had a tremendous upsurge in school shootings, from 2 a year to 1 a month. It was the year in which we found toxic water in one of the major cities in America. It was the world in which we became very worried about immigration and violence. It was the last time that we had an election, and it was a particularly nasty election. And what you can see is that there was an incredible shift in some of these passion points in a single year. You know, this is the passion point of protection and safety. Again, one of the over 100 that we track, which went from being a non-entity as an emotional priority for American, in this case, this is parent data, to being the #1 emotional priority in a single year. But what's important, I think, about this chart is that it didn't go back down. It's not like, oh, 2016 passed, we'll all go back to normal, right? No, we don't go back to normal. You know, once trust has been broken in our community, in our society, in ourselves, once the world no longer plays by the rules that it always has played, it takes a long, long time for these emotional truths that used to be our norms to go back to where they were, if ever. So whether it is a new sense of free-floating fear and anxiety, whether it was a complete shift in parents' notions of what it means to be raising a kid who prepared to succeed, with curricular learning taking a nosedive and more practical life skill learning taking a huge increase, these things didn't go away. They've stayed with us for a long, long time, which is why we feel that when we have, you know, an important movement in these passion points, it's a really good predictor of what is here to stay. Which of these emotional trends will outlast the pandemic? So with that, let me sort of jump from the past on some of our past data to today's data and what we're seeing exactly as we sort of progress into the fall of 2020 through these quarterly dips. I'm going to talk about 4 different themes which we think are here to stay. And for each one of them, I'm going to try and connect the dots for you between what is that overarching shift which has taken place in us as human beings. How have we changed emotionally as a result of this pandemic and the other events of 2020? This is going to be US data, by the way. But then importantly, how did we begin to see some of these things manifest in the passion points that also drive categories? And what you're going to see very quickly is that there is no wall that separates these two things. I mean, anybody who has the notion that my overall emotional priorities don't really live in the world of detergent or restaurants or media choices, that's not true. It's simply not true. We look for relief from these emotional needs anywhere we can get them. And if there is a fruit snack or a movie or a restaurant that delivers them, so be it. And you will see that appear in these new emotional drivers at a category level. So we'll begin at the high level, which is human passions. We'll move then into the category level. And finally, for each one of these 4 themes, I'll offer either an example or a thought starter on how an industry or a brand could or already has began to make a lot of money and generate a lot of relevance by getting ahead of these emotional truths by leveraging the assets they have in their brand. So with that, let me jump into this. And for those of you who have been through some of these webinars that we've had earlier in the year, you're going to see one or two familiar themes, but I included those because they've only gotten stronger since the last time we began measuring these things. The first one is this really, I think, important and profoundly significant shift in parents. We're going to begin with parents and work our way down to kids. We'll do one for parents, one for young adults, one for teenagers, and one for kids. So for parents, there has been a historic, what I consider to be a historic shift in their emotional priorities from being a slave to their kids' needs, being completely obsessed with being their kids' best friend and their kids' happiness, their kids' success, their kids' well-being, to being much more aware and much more emotionally focused on satisfying their own needs as opposed to just their children's needs. So this is going to give you some of the latest updates that we have, the latest sort of data that we have on these emotional priorities. And you can see that on the left-hand side, these are the red shift passion points. These are ones that are getting more emotionally relevant. And these are indexes versus 2019. Every single one of these red shift passion points is about me. It's about my friendships, my level of fun, my career, my sense of belonging. And what you see on the right-hand side of these decreasing blue shift passion points are all about my kids. About my kids teaching them learn to take care of themselves and discovering their world and expressing who they really are. Then none of this is to say that parents have stopped caring about their kids or that these are unimportant passion points. But in terms of movement, in terms of what is getting more important and less important, the left-hand stuff, the me love passion points are getting more important, and the we love passion points are getting less important. I am reminded of the announcement that the flight attendants used to make back when we flew on airplanes in the old days. Before taking off, where they would say, please put on your own oxygen mask before assisting the needs of others. And that is what parents are doing right now. They're putting their own oxygen mask on first. They are making sure that they are taking care of themselves, because without that, they can't be good parents. They can't love their kids the way their kids need to be loved if they aren't healthy themselves. All right, fair enough. So this is a significant shift in the overall disposition emotionally of parents, but you make cars or you make appliances or you are in the world of restaurants. What does that mean for you? Well, we track these exact same passion points at each one of these category levels, and we can tell you which are going up or going down or more important or less important at a category level. So let's look at the world of restaurants, for example. It has always been axiomatic in the world of family dining that families go there to indulge their kids. They go there to have fun together as a family. That has always been the #1 passion point driver of family restaurant dining for the last 15 years of our doing this research. In 2020, that changed. For the first time, that changed. And all of a sudden, the passion point for parents of choosing foods that I feel good about eating became the dominant driver, and having fun together as a family became much less important. Not unimportant, it didn't go away, but it is no longer the #1 thing that brings families into restaurants, period. And I predict that is here to stay. So what does that mean? Well, again, in the world of family restaurants, it has always been all about kids' meals. Family marketing has largely been about delighting the child, not so much the mom and dad. Whether it's McDonald's or Burger King or Subway or the others that all have significant investments and significant sub-brands in their kid program, that's great, but that is no longer the #1 magnet that's bringing these families in a post-pandemic world. And it might be a good idea to do some serious rethinking about whether or not you want to continue to hang your hat on an emotional driver which has lost that much relevance in your category, and think more about the things that you do which are going to delight a mom or a dad, like the provenance of your food or the great taste of your food or the indulgence of your food. These have all become extremely important to parents, not just young adults. So again, there's this direct line that connects the dots between these new human truths, these category drivers, and these brand growth opportunities for relevance. So let's move down now from parents to young adults. These are the 32-year-olds of the world, the 28-year-olds of the world. This is one of the ones that also kind of blows my mind, because this has always been a generation which has been relentlessly forward-looking and forward-leaning. This is a generation which has not been terribly interested in the past. They have, in large part, rejected the values and beliefs of their parents and grandparents, which they, in many cases, view as sexist or racist or other labels that have been put on them. They've been all about the future. Well, guess what? The pandemic has changed that. Now, one of the things that the pandemic has done in terms of these redshift, these increasing passion points that they're getting more important over time, has made them much, much more attuned to civics and politics. One of the things about millennials in the past is they didn't vote. They were very concerned about organic tomatoes, but a little less concerned about getting out to vote for president of the United States. That the pandemic has changed that. And all the sort of upheaval at a political level, I think certainly has changed that also. You can see there's a huge level of increase. Significance in this study is 2 percentage points. So we're at a 153 index versus last year. But what I want to draw your attention to is the middle one on this page, not the ones about politics, but the one about tradition, family tradition. These are 28-year-olds who are suddenly getting religion about the importance of where I came from. And I think a big part of the reason for that is that the future has gotten very dark and very uncertain and maybe a little less sexy than it used to be 7 months ago. And there's been a new realization that maybe some of the, not all the things, but some of the things that I sort of absorbed and came from and stood for through my past and the people that populate my past are important. So you make carbonated beverages. You're in the world of drinks. What does this have to do with you? Well, here's what it has to do with you. When you look at the emotional drivers of beverages, there's been a 44% increase in beverages that sort of restore and reconnect you with the past and the familiar. And the passion points that always used to be very significant for these young adults, like showing my individuality and my wild side, are plummeting in emotional relevance. Okay, that matters a lot in terms of what beverages you push forward, as well as how you talk about your beverages. And our friends at the Coca-Cola Company, in my mind, have done a brilliant job leveraging this passion point with our new Diet Coke campaign. This is a brand which has got a very strong heritage with older women in the U.S., and they're trying to find relevance with young women. And as a consequence, because they have seen this research and they know that these insights are important, they have restaged their brand around this line of drink what your mama gave you. Not the future, the past. And suddenly this is working for them. Moving down to the ages and stages to Gen Z and these teenagers and very young adults, the 20-year-olds and down to the 13-year-olds. This gets a little, for me, a little depressing. I think the young adult thing was a little encouraging, but the Gen Z stuff is nothing but discouraging, if you will, because what's happened here is a complete loss of Gen Z teen swagger. This whole notion of, hey, I'm 16, I tell my parents to shove it, I will create my own traditions, and I will sort of set my own standards, and I will create and find my own friends, and my own musical delights and so on. Man, that is like gone. And what we're seeing now is a chastened generation migrating from rebellion and self-expression to one craving recognition and terrified of being left behind. They are scared. So you can see some of these redshift, these trending up passion points that reflect this. It's not about being, out there creating their own social media content. It's about making sure that I don't get left behind, having what others have, having some form of recognition in a world where I'm sort of confined to my home. Concerned about having a boyfriend or girlfriend, my family not having enough money to buy groceries. Okay, this is not the low income, quote unquote. This is all of them. Or being a parent someday, not an MBA star, a parent someday. This is hardly the signs of a generation which is out on the leading edge and sort of taking risks and cutting edges. They're not doing that. The rug has been pulled out from under them, and it will take a long time for them to restore faith in the world that made them so many promises, every one of which have now been broken. We promise you can go to school. We promise you can drive. We promise you can have a girlfriend. We promise you can be independent. We promise you can go to college. No, 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 and no. None of those things are happening. And this is the consequence. So you're in the media space. You are Netflix. You are MTV. You are YouTube. How do you respond to this? Like, to what extent is this manifesting in your world or your category? Big time. The passion points that drive Gen Z media consumption, like exploration and self-discovery are all going down. And the passion points that they connect to content and media experiences that make them feel safe and content in my home, as one example of the several of the 30 that we track, are skyrocketing. And as a consequence, it comes as absolutely no surprise that the #1 show that all these Gen Z are watching night and day, above everything else, is Friends and The Office, over and over and over again, produced 25 years ago, at a simpler time based on friendships that I could trust, not so much sex education. And then finally, as we get down to kids, another sort of, there's a lot of stuff that's very troubling about kids in terms of how their world has been changed by the pandemic and some of these emotional shifts that are here to stay. There's also some good stuff here also. And one of them is this renewed sense and commitment to this idea of fairness. 8-year-olds' realization the world is neither fair nor just and eager to become its advocate for change. I think kids have always had like a very strong fairness bone in them. I mean, if you give 2 kids, 2 friends, 2 cookies and one's bigger than the other, you're going to hear about it immediately. The kid that got the smaller cookie is going to say, that's not fair. I deserve a bigger cookie also. But that sense of fairness has been kind of enlarged and redirected as a result of this pandemic into a much broader and open public space. So this is the extent to which 7-year-olds are increasing in their emotional concern and prioritization around climate change, a 192 index versus 8 months ago. This is kids saying, you know, I'm not so sure that adults have a clue what's going on. And maybe their rules aren't the right rules, a 163 index. The future of our country. I didn't know what that meant when I was 7. I couldn't begin to tell you what that meant, a 147 index. Pitching to help, resilience and fortitude. You know, these are the new drivers of these young people. So as you think about things like toys, okay, well, let's have a look at this. I mean, here is the world of toys as it used to be, a really fun way to goof off and blow off steam, escaping from pressure and stress, to what kids are telling us today they want, which are toys that sort of can satisfy some of their social justice aspirations, like being kind and acceptance of people who are different from me. These kids are very attuned to that. And as a consequence, you know, this is an older example, but one that I continue to bow down to. You know, when Lego launched a new line of toys several years ago, based on the movie Hidden Figures, about those amazing African-American women who sort of conquered racism at NASA to become data scientists in that environment in the 50s. They made a toy about that. It sold out on Amazon. It's not easy to sell things out on Amazon, but they did. So how can you sort of think about kids not so much as a victim of these terrible changes in the world to a part of the solution? And how can you create foods or toys or entertainment experiences that empower and encourage and foster that innate sense of fairness? Because it's never been more ignited than it is right now. So there you go, 4 themes that are here to stay: parents, young adults, teens, and kids. And if I were to give you a couple of thoughts, or offer, I should say, a couple of thoughts to kind of chew on as you depart this webinar and go back to your day job, here's what they are. The first one is, if you are waiting for the world to return to some semblance of what you knew before the pandemic, stop. Just stop. It's not going to go back anytime soon, at least from an emotional standpoint. It simply won't. I do not believe, having seen 14 years of this data and the exact same trends every single time, that when the triggers of cultural disruption go away, emotions will stabilize and go back. They're not going to. So that's, you know, number one. Number two is, on a category level, think about, as you try to understand what's here to stay, looking beyond circumstantial behaviors, which again may be very temporary, to emotional shifts, which tend to be lasting, to understand COVID's lasting impact. I mentioned already the world of disinfectants, which I'm not sure is going to become a long-term part of our lives the way they have been for the last 6 months. But I'll bet you that adults' fascination with Eastern religion and spirituality is here to stay. You know, our friends at Random House have been seeing a very significant lift in their publishing of these types of books. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, because that's an emotional shift, not a behavioral shift. And the third thought, just to, if you'll permit me a little bit of self-promotion here, think about complementing your existing brand tracker with emotional relevance tracking, some sort of mechanism which lets you have a look at how your brand's assets are juxtaposing with the emotional priorities of your target audience, because those are what's on the left is moving. That's dynamic. Those are no longer permanent. What's on the right is pretty stationary, and we're able to put these two things together to calculate a number which signifies your emotional relevance and what's driving that. So I hope that was useful. We've got a few minutes left for questions, but thank you so much for joining us. And of course, if you've got other questions, you want to talk about more details on our study and the works that we do, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, George. Again, we have a few questions, and please send them in if you've got some other ones. One question actually that was about your we to me observation, George, and whether or not you think that is in some way maybe driven by more millennials joining the parenthood, and they've been always referred to, I guess, as the me generation. So whether their values are shifting some of that.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and we are able to look at this parent stuff from parents who have a 0-year-old, newborn parents, all the way up to 60-year-olds like myself that have college age or post-college parents, and there really isn't a significant shift, a difference in this. Every parent of every generation, I think, has realized that this loss of agency and this constricted, shrinking universe has led to challenges which they never knew they were going to face, and a recognition that they have to take care of themselves. So for sure, millennials are a significant part of that, but not the only part of it. It's an excellent question.
Then a question about, how brands, and a number of examples, I think what you referenced the Diet Coke in the question, but whether brands should think about, when they think about their role, should they change based on these changes, or should they wait till things settle down? What kind of, I guess they're looking for some advice.
Yeah, I think that if you wait, you're going to be waiting a long time. As I said earlier, I think the world's going to get ahead of you and beyond you if you wait. I understand certainly that you can't just be changing your purpose and position every time a passion point shifts. That's not at all what we're suggesting. And in fact, I think that some of the most important passion points, which I did not talk about in this webinar, are the ones that didn't change. Which one of those passion points are so fundamentally important, sacred to us, that plagues and pandemics and elections don't change them. Having said that, in neither case, whether you sort of chase a trending passion point or a stable passion point, should you deviate from what's in your brand DNA. We map the emotional DNA of brands, 10 times a week. We've done it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of brands. And your brands, any brand, even the most quote unquote mundane brand, has at least 7 or 8 emotional assets in it. It doesn't do one thing, it probably does 7 things emotionally for it. So I think the question or the idea that we're putting forward is find the asset that you've already got, which matters, and be very sensitive to not hanging on to an asset which may have been a part of your kind of consumer dialogue, which has lost relevance.
Then, George, a clarification question on about when we talk about kids' toys. Is that through the lens of what kids want or what parents are buying for their kids?
Kids, what kids want.
Yeah. And then final question, I think was because you referenced that this was U.S. data. Somebody asked if we were seeing any big differences between countries.
Yeah. That is such an interesting question, and the answer is an emphatic yes. One of the things that you will quickly see when you look at this data on a global scale is that the very different national responses that we have had to COVID has led to completely separate new emotional profiles for consumers across the world. We used to be very, very similar emotionally, for example, to parents or non-parents in the UK and Germany. We aren't anymore. So there's levels of fear, anxiety, unexpectation, which exist in certain parts of the world that don't exist in other parts of the world. And it's become a much more difficult play to find a single unifying emotional truth on which to hang a global brand. They're there, but they are becoming fewer and farther between as a result of this pandemic.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there for this webinar. Thanks again for attending, and hopefully the insights here will inspire you. And again, please check your email for invitations to upcoming webinars. We're about ready to launch our next wave of our research, so we're expecting another trove of new insights that will come through as part of our next wave of the Passion Point research that we're doing both here and globally. So we look forward to seeing you again, and thank you for attending.